It's a kind of a keynote and conversation with the Reverend Jim Wallis, speaking on a new social covenant, values and trust for a moral economy, to be followed by a response by Stuart Wallis. And as I did have previously, I just want to provide short introductions. You have already heard that Jim Wallis is a driving force behind the new social covenant. He's the president and CEO of Sojourners, a prominent commentator on religion and public life issues in this country and around the world, as well as a prolific author. I'll just mention Jim's last book, which came out earlier this year, On God's Side, What Religion Forgets and Politics Hasn't Learned About Serving the Common Good. The respondent is Stuart Wallis, no relation, although a kindred spirit, the CEO of the UK-based New Economics Foundation, a position he's held since 2003. And there, Stuart and his colleagues explore issues of global governance, sustainability, and the future of capitalism and the moral economy. Before joining the foundation, Stuart served as Oxfam's international director, and for his service with Oxfam, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 2002. So please join me in welcoming Jim and Stuart Wallis.
It's a big leap up, isn't it?
The Order of the British Empire. Wow. We're going to turn this keynote into a conversation, and I want to hear more from all of you. I was recalling, as Chelsea was sitting here, the first time I met her years and years ago, she was in high school, and her family came to a retreat over in New York called Renaissance, and we used to go there too. And I was doing a session, and she came in with her friends, and she came up and peppered me with questions for half an hour afterwards. And we were just going back and forth for half an hour. And to me, that's a great model for all of you. In fact, out of our conversations the last 2 days, we came down to this: ask the right questions. Ask the right questions. So that's, I think, a new generation. That's part of your job. Part of your responsibility to ask the right questions. So we're going to just talk to you about the social covenant, kind of how it happened and what it means. And I hope you'll read it. It's on your chairs. Now, I've got some of my students here, and they're going to have to read. I'm going to require it. But I can't require it of all of you. I encourage you to read this carefully. So Stuart and I are going to talk a little bit about this. We co-authored this, but it's becoming kind of a living document now, going way beyond a document to a conversation. So I want to have that conversation with you in our final session here today. There was a panel discussion at Davos, I recall, January 2009, after the fall of 2008. And Davos was, I think, in complete panic about where they were. The financial crisis just occurred. And so a conversation that I was told really hadn't happened before happened on the plenary floor, prime time, called Market and Values. The Market and Values. Now, since Davos has had lots of discussions about values, but that was the first one that many of us recalled for a long time. And I remember in that panel discussion, I raised this question: what do you do when the invisible hand of the market lets go of the common good? What do you do? And that's been the conversation really ever since. Now, Adam Smith, as you know, who wrote The Wealth of Nations about the invisible hand, in his previous book wrote The Moral Sentiments. And it was saying that without a moral framework, the market really can't work. It doesn't work properly where there is no moral framework. And the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter said, without ethics, the market will end up devouring everything and ultimately even itself, which is what happened in the fall of 2008. Diana was very good on so many things, but I loved her notion of the market as a tool, a market economy. Now we become a market society. And that's a fundamental shift. And I think when the market becomes the society, really it's what I would call market fundamentalism. where everything becomes driven by market values and forces and nothing else remains to put the market in context, in perspective. In our sessions, we had great sessions the last couple of days, thanks to Jack DeJoya, Tom Banshoff, and the Georgetown crew here, and all the participants who came, some of whom are still here. And I loved, is Dahlia still here? She left. Well, she had this wonderful, we're talking about at Davos now, a moral economy. Well, that's a kind of, I didn't expect that term to come from Davos, but that's what they're saying now. But she took it deeper and she said, how do we move from a commodity-based economy, which is where we are now, to a knowledge-based economy, to a wisdom-based economy? Commodity, knowledge, and wisdom. Let's at least be smarter than we are, knowing what we know, but let's talk about what a wisdom-based economy might look like. So when you read the covenant, you'll see there's really, it's a moral conversation, and we chose the word covenant deliberately. We have broken social contracts. Now, I'm from Detroit. Let me tell you about the social contract that I grew up with that has just been destroyed. I mean, all of the families came out of World War II. We all had 3-bedroom houses, same neighborhoods. College or not, people had jobs. If their kids wanted a job at GM, Chrysler, Ford, they could have one too. Pensions, there were unions, they were healthy. There was a social contract. And now, when I tell people that, they can't believe that ever happened anywhere, right? And so we've lost our social contracts up and down society. And I don't think it's enough to talk about a new social contract. In fact, the business people in our Values Council were the ones who said, we should call it a covenant, because that implies a moral dimension to this that we've lost and really need. So social contracts being broken, the social covenants being forged. Now, the road to that, I think, as you read this, has a number of clear commitments. I would say, here's the road for a new moral economy. From massive inequality to decent equity, from a narrow definition of shareholders, as Diana said, to a broader vision of stakeholders, which Stuart will talk more about, from short-term to long-term, from the ethics of endless growth to the ethics of sustainability, from doing well to also doing good, from broken social contracts to a new social covenant between citizens, business, and government. So, being the chair of the Values Council, my concern has been at Davos, let's just not have a values seminar at Davos every year, then go back to our places of work and see nothing really change. Values don't matter much if there are no metrics, no results, no outcomes, no changes. So here's a quote from John Reed, founder of Citigroup, told the New York Times. Now, this is now since the crisis. There's nothing I've seen that gives me the slightest feeling that these people, his colleagues on Wall Street, have learned anything from the crisis. They don't get it. They're off in a different world. We talked about that, Diana mentioned that, how we're in such a segregated world now. We're all in our own worlds, and we don't really see, not necessarily bad people, they don't see or touch or know anyone that has been impacted in the ways that they've been impacted by. There was a big story, you might recall, when a senator in this town said he changed his point of view on gay rights when he learned his son was gay. The press called me the next day, did I think about that? I said, well, how would it change, and John asked this question, how would it change our response to budgets and deficits and fiscal debates if the senators, any of them, had a son who was poor? They don't. And that's the problem with the conversation. I want to say to students especially, I've learned most about the world from being in places where I wasn't supposed to be, or being with people that I wasn't supposed to ever meet. So part of our new sense of covenant is finally breaking away from that narrow segregation of our lives, our friends, our conversations, so we actually know what's happening in different places than we live in. That's, I think, a huge part of the problem here. So the characteristics here of a covenant, you can read it, but it talks about transparency and accountability. It's been mentioned here. We've got to know what's going on, understand what's going on, and hold people accountable for decisions. People have lost trust in where decisions are made, who makes them, and how they're being made. So transparency and accountability are key. I would say, second, protect consumers. Any pastor that I know would tell you the story of his or her congregates being just cheated, abused, destroyed by debt. Joel Hunter is a friend of some of ours in Florida. I'd say it's a middle class, upper middle megachurch congregation in Orlando. He did a survey of his congregation, and he asked them how much debt they owe, each family, how much debt they have. Didn't count car debt or house debt, other kind of debt. The average was $31,000 per family. He calls that debt slavery. The Bible talks a lot about debt slavery. So I was really impressed by the new Archbishop Church of England, Justin Welby, I met 2 weeks ago, where he's launched now in the UK a church-based credit union system to be an alternative to the payday lenders who are putting people in debt. And he didn't just say, I'm doing this on the side as a nice ministry. He said, he pointed his finger at them. He says, I'm going to put you out of business. I'm going to put you out of business. He's creating, how do you do things differently than the payday lenders do? So we talk about the volatility of financial exchanges, which create great riches for some and devastation for others. We talked in our session today about what some traders have said to me from Wall Street. They've said, when our industry finance, when we are producing 10 to 12, 15% of corporate profits, that's about right. We're facilitating productive capitalism. Now we're producing 42% of corporate profits. That means something has gone wrong. This is money just making money, not products, services. Something has gone wrong from inside the industry. I'm hearing this. This is a huge shift that we have to deal with. So banks are part of this too. The 4 biggest banks now have grown 30% since the crisis. They're 30% bigger now. The too big to fail. My concern is at some point banks are too big to serve the common good. What does that mean about banks and how they should function? And the Archbishop, who is from the financial industry, recently says, we need a revolution, this is an Archbishop, in the aims of banks so they exist to serve the society that they are in. Companies are not self-regarding things to maximize returns for shareholders. Now, he was an executive in the oil industry. Now he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he's being listened to in a different kind of way. Diana said it well. When we have, she said, a shareholder obsession, when our metric is quarterly profit and loss statements for shareholders, we are in serious, serious trouble. Indigenous people say you evaluate decisions by their impact on the 7th generation out. Now, look at the difference between those metrics. More of a balance is going to be critical here. How do we think long-term and not short-term? And how do we evaluate decisions by their impact on stakeholders, which Stuart will talk about. Finally, I'll just say the issue of trust is critical here. The covenant says at the end, it says, lack of trust is bad for politics, bad for business, and bad for overall public morale. It undermines people's sense of participation in society, as well as their feelings of social responsibility. It makes them feel isolated and alone, more worried about survival than interested in solidarity. Because the contract was broken, a sense of covenant is now needed, fused with a sense of moral values and commitments. And the process of formulating new social covenants could be an important part of finding the solution. So this conversation we had yesterday today is helping to shape this whole process. What would it look like to ask the conversation we're doing in South Africa? Daniel's going to do that in this next year in Cape Town. How do we have a conversation about what a new social covenant needs to have to shape the conversation, change the metrics, the outcomes, the decision-making? Okay? Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Well, Jim's brilliantly, as always, covered the whole issue of market fundamentalism, the lack of trust, the role of banks, the issue of debt, and the issue, which I totally agree with you, that you learn best by listening to people right across the world. I learned more in my time in Oxfam, working with some of the most remote and poorest communities on earth, and you saw in some of those communities amazing resilience, amazing degrees of coherence and trust between them. And it's not related to how much money one has. Trust is built on other things. But just one quote on the issue, Jim, of market fundamentalism, and I also like what Diana was saying there. It's by Amory Lovins, who happens to be an American ecologist, some of you may have heard of. And he basically said, very wisely, markets make a good servant, a poor master, and a worse religion. And I would say that we've got markets as religion, and that's a very dangerous thing to have. I want to bring two things into the conversation. First of all, a bit more about stewardship, and particularly of the planet, but also of other people on this planet now and of future generations. And secondly, as Jim has indicated, say a bit about companies. But before I go into stewardship, let me tell you about the hamster. And I checked with a number of people earlier that you do call those furry things that we have in the UK, you call them hamsters here as well, because I wasn't quite sure whether it translated. But this is the impossible hamster. Now, a baby hamster doubles its birth weight every week from birth to puberty. That's a fact. But at puberty, it stops. If it didn't stop at puberty, at 1 year old, it would weigh 9 billion tons, and would eat every day the whole world's food supply. And the point of this story is there are limits in nature. And we've forgotten that the economy is a subset of our ecosystem. So if you want to see it, Google impossible hamster, because there's a hamster that gets bigger and bigger and chomps up the New York skyscrapers and then chomps up the earth and then floats off with a fat belly into space. So it's fun. But the story is very important. And we've forgotten that there are natural limits. And in the past, you come up against those natural limits if you're on an island like Easter Island or a constrained community or in a very remote communities. But generally, economics has assumed that the resources, most of the resources we use in our production and apply capital and labor to, are pretty well free. That has ceased to be true. And it changes economics fundamentally, and I think it changes the value sets we need to apply. So back in 1980, up to 1980, humankind had lived within the carrying capacity of the planet, the whole of human history. So overall, we had not consumed more than the planet was able to regenerate every year. That ceased to be true in 1980. And since at this point in time, in 30 short years, which is nothing in human time or a geological time, which I used to be a geologist, 30 short years, we've gone from consuming 1 planet's worth of resources to consuming 1.5 planets worth of resources. And we're on target at the minute for 3 planets by 2050. That's sobering, and you can see the effects of it already. You can see the effects in climate change, and if you look at the NASA pictures of summer sea ice in 1980, and you look at them now, you'll see that that summer sea ice is reduced by 1/2 in area and 3/4 in volume. And you can see it from space, it's really clear. But not only are we risking really serious runaway climate change, and some estimates say this planet won't be able to support more than a couple of billion people in another 50 to 100 years' time. I'm not as pessimistic as that, but if we carry on the current trend, we're definitely going a wrong way, let alone what we do to all sorts of other species. But we're also running very short of water, topsoil, pollination systems are under risk. So the UN Millennium Systems Assessment, Ecosystems Assessment said that 15 out of 25 of our life support systems, like water, pollination systems, etc., are at risk or severe risk. So we have to do something very rapidly about that. And technology will help. But to assume that just clever technology is going to sort it for us would be very unwise indeed. It certainly isn't sorting it on climate change. It's an issue about how we live and the values at which we live, which is why it's not just a good thing, but it's absolutely a crucial thing that a change in our value set comes about, so we start seeing ourselves as stewards, not consumers. And that's a big change. And it literally does change most of the macroeconomics textbooks. And sorry, I shouldn't say this in a hallowed hall there, but now they're pretty well redundant. Microeconomics is probably still quite relevant, but quite a lot of the macroeconomic textbooks have not caught up with this at all. So it's quite a revolution that coming up against ecological limits is putting us under. And it will require stewardship and thinking like stewards. And stewards, as many people know, don't think in terms of what they own, and therefore they can use themselves. They think about how they can preserve something for the next generation, and also how they can share things across current generations. And this concept of stewardship, you might say, come on, you're dreaming. Well, I say to you, it's important to dream, and it's important to dream about a different economy, because we can make those dreams come true. And I really believe that with enough collective action. So what we're talking about, Jim and I and others who've been involved in the social covenant, is actually conceiving what this wisdom-based economy needs to look like. And some of it's a move back to the greatest collectivity and solidarity of the and greater wage share of the economy and things that Diana was talking about earlier of the 50s and 60s. Some of it, though, is moving into new territory, because the environmental stuff really makes us have to think about different ways of living again. And this is where it leads into many things. It leads into the question of whether we actually should and can own air, water, perhaps even minerals, land. That's quite a radical thought, but we have to think radically to deal with a big problem like this. We can't just think of it within the same frame. As Einstein said, you don't solve a problem by trying to use the same thinking that's got you in the problem in the first place. So this requires new thinking from all of us. It also requires new metrics, as Jim's already saying. So when you talk to people and ask them what they want out of an economy, and this is true across all sorts of societies, they tend to say, they don't use these terms, this is a bit more highfalutin, so I need to get better language, but they tend to say, actually, we want higher quality of life and well-being for ourselves and our children. We want a fairer society, don't always define what that is, and we want a society that preserves the planet for the generations that come after us. That's pretty universal. That's what people want. And it's the opposite of those four U's we were talking about at the beginning of unsustainable, unfair, unstable, and making people unhappy. It's the opposite. And I'm a great believer that is something we should demand. It's something we should have conversations about. At the minute, even in civil society, there isn't a very well organized civil society about what economic system we want. There's bits of it, but actually civil society tends to fall into development, environment, trade unions looking at one part of the picture, etc. But I use civil society very widely, because to bring about something like that is going to require lots of people of lots of different disciplines working together. I use the orchestra analogy. We all play our different instruments, but unless those of us who know change is necessary and want to bring it about start playing at least to some common scores, our different instruments, all we're going to do is make a discordant noise that won't be heard. And it does require, as Jim was saying, a breaking down of the barriers between business people, university leaders, faith leaders, civil society leaders, etc. It's only going to happen when all those different groups, those who know things are wrong and want to change, come together. So I see that it's very possible that we can create this wisdom economy, but it's going to require thinking very differently, and it's going to require still be a market economy, well, a society with a market economy, let's be clear, not a market society. But it will work to very different metrics, and above all, the values, the types of values we talk about in the social covenant are going to need to be absolutely embedded in that. And just quickly, Jim, on companies, you said I'd say a little bit. I was a business school graduate, and I did all this stuff, like many other people, on the purpose of a company is to maximize shareholder value. And I didn't really believe it then. I certainly don't believe it now. The purpose of a company is to do something for society. The issue, it has to make some money to do it. But the thing has got the wrong way round. And we need to go back to asking the question, what are we making money for and for whom? Rather than, so what's our purpose? So purposeful companies is the first thing. Moving from a shareholder to stakeholder is critical. And then changing the incentive structure. You need good leadership, and there can be a lot done about skill training, bringing values out into the open, etc. But at the same time, you need, just as the wider society, you need to change the incentive structure. So, as we heard earlier, ideas like you can't actually vote a stock until you've held it for 2 years. You might pay a much higher capital gain if you trade it within a very short time, whereas if you hold it for a long time, you don't pay a capital gain. We changed the fiduciary duty of pension funds. You could do that sort of stuff, but you could also change company taxation radically, because at the minute, we tax the value added of companies. We're taxing the good things. We want value added. We want something to be created. What we want to tax is the waste that isn't being recycled, is the use of non-renewable resources that are coming scarce. And we need to reconceive the idea. Everybody says glibly in their P&Ls and things, our employees are our greatest asset. Yet they're a liability on the profit and loss and the balance sheet. We actually need to create them an asset on the balance sheet. So you actually need to start seeing at least 2 equity holders, the people putting the capital in and the people working there. And that would radically change the equation as well, because we're going to need to change the equation in the world we're going into so that we can live within planetary means and create enough jobs. And that won't happen without changing the incentive structure for businesses radically. You cannot have it, the current structure, and deliver what you need. So that, and finally on the metrics, I'm not a great believer in triple bottom line or social and environmental impact statements. They're useful. But until the bottom line of the company reflects whether it's doing good or bad or harm, both not just economically, which is vital, but socially and environmentally, and the value goes up or down, then we'll start getting the incentives aligned in the right place. Enough from me, but that's...
I want to just lift up that framework and unpack it a bit, then open this up. I love Stuart's phrase, the uneconomy. And what that means is unfair, unsustainable, unstable, and in fact, making people unhappy. You talked about the sustainability. Let me talk about the unfairness. I was up at Occupy Wall Street 2 weeks after it started, and then in Dubai for the World Economic Forum 3 days later. And what was interesting, I think I was the only person, Jack, who was at both places during that week.
Yes, I think you were.
But what the issues were being raised on the cement in New York and the issues in a 5-star hotel in Abu Dhabi were really very similar. This issue of inequality is a fundamental part of why people distrust what's happening so much. As you heard, we can't go into detail here, but the covenant talks about this. We had a period, the old phrase was true, the Second World War to about 1975 or 80, the rising tide did lift all the boats. It really did. In fact, the bottom 20% did very well during that period. During that period, there was prosperity in which a lot of people shared. But really from 1980 onward, that changed dramatically. So you had, the covenant talks about this, but you can see the ratio went from 7-to-1 to 75-to-1. 80% of the real increase in wealth in the United States, 1980 to 2005, went to only 1% of the population. And this stat's in there too, it stuns me. The richest 400 people have as much wealth now as the poorest 155 million people. That was happening before the Great Recession. Two peak periods of inequality, Great Depression and Great Recession. Well, this week's the 5th anniversary. Listen to the coverage and the stats. The inequality is now worse than it was before the Great Recession. It's worse. And 1%, the top 1%, has captured 95% of the income gains. Here's why people are mad. A lot of ordinary people feel like, I was just doing my job, having my house, having my pension. I lost my pension, my job, and my house. And the people who helped make this happen are the only ones so far who have recovered. And that makes people very angry. So the inequality, and I want to say that, I think inequality is a necessary part of the human condition. Differences in gifts and talents and creativity and luck will make outcomes unequal, but the level of inequality is the issue.
It is.
And when it surpasses a certain point, it's very undermining of the whole society. Sense of belonging, ownership, sense of, in fact, the Wall Street Journal had an article here saying 3/4 of the American people think the system is rigged on behalf of the wealthiest and not to them. So unless we change this, and we're talking to business people now who understand that unless we change this broken contract, this will be bad for business too.
Yeah.
Trust is bad for, lack of trust is bad for business too. All right, I'd like to just open the conversation. We have about 20 minutes or so. So I'd like to hear questions, comments from all of you about the idea of forging a new social covenant from all you've heard today. Anyone jump in? Yes, please. Identify yourself and,
My name's Colin Steele, and I work here at Georgetown after graduating a year ago, and I spent a year in AmeriCorps, actually, beforehand. So, like you said, I got to see a whole different side of the country and a whole different kind of reality that I wasn't supposed to see. So, out of that, I'd like to ask you sort of a two-headed question. The first being, let's address honestly the role of religion or religious language in forging a covenant, because as you said, we're using that kind of language to frame the debate instead of business language of contracts. And I think Georgetown's a particularly good place to address that side of things. And the second thing is, let's focus on that fourth or bottom line of the uneconomy, the unhappy part. Because religion does a good job of saying to both the people at Davos and the people on the streets in New York, we understand you're not happy, we understand why you're not happy, but how can we be happy with what we've got, even when outcomes are not necessarily equal?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The conversation in the last couple of days, we had several takeaways, one of which is you've got to raise the moral argument. Whether religious or not, it's a moral argument. And religion has no monopoly on morality. But a lot of people outside the faith community are still looking for some kind of moral guidance from within side. And we talked about how leadership does make a difference. John Carr was talking about Pope Francis and how in a very short time he has changed the perception of the church for an awful lot of people. The Archbishop of Canterbury will do the same, I think. So how can the faith community, like for example, Islamic economics, as was pointed out by Adalia, has some very interesting things to offer on banking practices. There's a whole conversation how Christianity, Judaism, and Islam can help to shape the covenant conversation for people who are religious or not. And the framing is critical. How do we take moral arguments and help our colleagues who are business leaders see their relevance for their decision making? And I'm finding at Davos a growing number of younger entrepreneurs are wanting to do what stewards call purposeful business. They want to use their business skills to make a difference in the world, to solve problems. They don't want to just make money. They want profit, yes, but purpose as well. And so I asked Bill George, who was going to be here, who's a Davos regular Harvard Business School professor, what percentage of young business people do you think are in this category? He said, I think we're maybe at 12 to 15%. So makes me wonder, what would it mean if people who were people of faith or in schools like Georgetown, where these values are important, increase the critical mass of business people who are, as I'm being told by headhunters, are not taking the most lucrative package offered to them now, but taking some place where they think they can make a difference. Yeah. So this is going to be, a covenant will require pressure from outside and inside business. We need, I think, better regulatory integrity. I do think that's important. But that alone won't do it unless business itself begins to ask new questions inside. At Davos one night after dinner, somebody said, I love the plenary session today. What you said, I really agree. Really inspired me. I said, now, don't you work for, and I won't say who, don't you work for? And they said, yeah. Did your company have practices and products that help create this crisis? And they said, yeah. What happens when you go home and raise that? I can't do that. We can't do that. There's no safe place for that.
Yeah.
How do we create spaces? Business professor here from South Africa, how do we create the spaces for business people to ask these moral questions? This covenant will provide some space and framework for having those conversations. Yeah. And then the second question, I'll let Stuart talk about being happy.
Being happy. Well, my organization does a lot of measuring happiness, and you do it via survey techniques, and you ask lots of questions. So it's not just, are you happy? Because I can be happy on an illegal substance, but I wouldn't be flourishing, would I? Or at least I certainly wouldn't think I would be. So you're trying to look at how people are flourishing, what resilience they've got, what energy they've got, what their long-term sense of well-being and quality of life is. So those are the sort of questions you ask. And very interestingly, what you see is, yes, there is a large correlation between income and well-being up to a certain level. People do need a certain level of income to live on, and if they're vulnerable, etc., that affects their well-being very badly. But once you get past a certain level, then more and better part company. More money does not equal a better life. And interestingly, what people delude themselves very widely about what's going to make them happy. So they buy more and more things. It actually doesn't have much impact on their happiness at all. And very interestingly, the key things that affect overall societal happiness as opposed to individual happiness or individual well-being is a combination of your psychological resources in yourself and how valued and you feel by others, how valuable you feel your work is in life, and your quality of your relationships. So it's a mixture of those things. But societal well-being is very affected by inequality, lack of trust, crime, unemployment. All those things don't just affect the people who are unemployed or suffering the inequality. They affect everybody. So interestingly, the data is very clear that even the richest are not going to be happier with a split society. So you can bring another argument, actually, if you're looking at people's quality of life, then a more equal society, back to all the things Jim's just been talking about, and one which has a much greater focus on stewardship and giving, because the other thing that gives people some of the greatest sense of well-being is giving freely of love, time, money, whatever it might be. And that's not where you look up giving in an economic textbook, you won't find it. You won't find that, that's not rational man, and I use that term purposely, rational man, which was the basis of a lot of economic textbooks, whereas giving is fundamental to our well-being. So I think one can make a very good case out of lots of disciplines that not only can you have a better society, you can also have a happier society if you implement some of these things that are in the covenant.
Okay. Another question.
We should stun you into silence.
Please.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Taylor. Jim, you talked a little bit about metrics, and I'm curious, that sort of raised a red flag for me. How do you measure the effectiveness of this commitment? Are there some practical ways that you plan to sort of assess moving forward?
Good question. For me, it came in the Davos conversations on values, where I was with a lot of business leaders, CEOs, others, who really were sincerely wrestling with, or when they find that I'm a pastor, they want to sit me in a corner and talk about almost confessionally. It was very kind of a interesting sort of conversations I'd have. Well, I used to be a Catholic, or I'm this or that, and I just am not comfortable with what's happening in my business. So it's personal, pastoral, and then in the larger context. But decision-making wasn't changing in many of their companies. And they were trying to figure out how I could make that happen. So what I've said to the Davos councils is I'm happy to, be on this values council if we are moving toward results from a values conversation, metrics, decision-making being different. And so far, in 5 years, we've not seen different decision-making, particularly on the financial side. There is some conversation now on the corporate side about turning, when a factory collapses in Bangladesh and people are killed who are making our clothes. At Georgetown here, I think it's true that you all, the Georgetown t-shirts and sweatshirts have to pass some tests about whether or not they're being made by kids who are being exploited and so on. So that notion of value chains being turned into supply chains. I'm having those conversations with business people who realize this is something their customers are going to be asking of them.
Yeah.
So decision-making, resource allocation. Mohammed Yunus at the session we had in Davos, he had the whole crowd eating out of his hand when he talked about how they're using business practices to solve problems in Bangladesh. Water, infant mortality, all kinds of things successfully. He's making payroll, he's making profits, but then he said at the end, but of course we pile the profits, business back into the next business to solve the next problem, so our executive compensation isn't what you're used to. All of a sudden, it's, well, lunchtime, It shut down the entire conversation. So what I'm trying to get to is what are the obstacles that really prevent us from putting values into operation? What are the things that really are there that we have to address structurally? Safe places to talk about things. What's the ethos of the corporation? What regulatory changes have to happen with banks and so on? So I think metrics are saying values have to become, as someone said in our discussion, virtues that are actually lived out behaviors. Make sense?
Yeah. And the other thing I think on metrics is, I think you need to start at all sorts of different levels. So I was mentioning about measuring company bottom lines differently, but I think if we're really going to have something as big a change as getting towards this wisdom-based economy or a more moral economy, you're going to need metrics that help get us there. So interestingly, particularly in Europe now, there's been a lot of work that we've been involved with, other people have, in measure what should be the metrics for national progress. So we're looking at things like how much human well-being has gone up, how long people are living, but also are they preserving natural resources? I mean, to give you an example we were talking about earlier, which is the most efficient economy? If I give you an example, Costa Rica or the USA. The USA is generating GDP is 5 times more per head, per person. That's not medium, that's mean GDP in the US than Costa Rica. So clearly, straight economics, US is 5 times better. But hang on, people are living longer in Costa Rica, life expectancy is longer because of a brilliant health and education system. Their measured well-being is higher, and they're virtually 99% renewable electricity already, and they are generating those things on a fifth of the energy consumption and consumption of natural resources that the US is. So which is the better economy? Because that really is both a values question and a metrics question. And in our wisdom-based economy, I would argue, all other things being equal, Costa Rica isn't perfect apart from the Latin vibe, but I would argue Costa Rica actually is the better performing economy. But it does, so the metrics make a difference. And in Europe, we've now started, in UK, for example, we're now measuring people's well-being on an annual basis. And very interesting results are coming out of that.
Yeah.
So you do need to start, what we need, I think, to do with different constituents is take this wisdom-based or moral economy, actually spell out what it means more, and then say, what are the metrics and what are the steps to get us there? Because it's doable.
We have Michelle Mischler here from the World Economic Forum. Raise your hand. And her coming has been a great deal of this conversation, and their partnering with us has been critical. So one thing we talked about was how the World Economic Forum can be not only a safe space for a values conversation, but how the forum, with its credibility, its access, could help in talking about how to evaluate economies, not just by wealth production, but by all these things, by as Klaus Schwab has been talking about stakeholder economy since the beginning of the World Economic Forum. It's his passion, not just shareholders, but stakeholders. So how would you evaluate economies by what happens to their stakeholders? And I think the forum could do a great service by beginning to encourage, train, teach, and evaluate economies by these broader values that are in the social covenant here. So it's been great. Do you have any thoughts about that? Any?
As I mentioned earlier today as well, in our global competitiveness report, which we put out every year and which probably most of you are familiar with, there's now also an appendix, which is a sustainable index, a competitive sustainability index, which we're starting to flesh out. I think last year was the first year we did that, and this year it's been a little more in depth. So this is something that we are actively pursuing, and hopefully that will become an index in itself as well. So we're definitely on the right track.
Right.
Fantastic.
Okay. Yeah. Any last final word here, question anyone has? Well, I want to thank you all. I want to say again, I really want to encourage you to read this new social covenant, and I'd love your feedback. And those of us here, you could, sojo.net, sojo.net is our website. And I'd love you to give us your comments. Sandy, you raise your hand, you're here. I'd love to hear your comments, your feedback. We're trying to forge and form and revise this. A year-long conversation going toward next January at Davos. So it's an important task, and we're going to need a new generation to help provide the leadership that this is calling for.
Definitely.
So thank you for your time, and I appreciate your coming, and thanks again to Jack for hosting
hugely.
us.
Yeah.
And the president doesn't hang out as much at something like he has unless he cares about it personally. So I thank you, Jack, for your time.